Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now, have you ever placed a bid on something on eBay and forgotten that you did, either because you weren't bothered if you won it, or you just thought you might get lucky with a super low offer? Well, that's what happened here. I placed a 1 penny bid on the CPU a few days ago, and next thing you know, I'd won it. Okay, so I had to pay an additional 50 pence for postage, but with the item itself not receiving much bidding attention, it made me think why. Maybe it was because the seller had zero feedback, or maybe it was because it was a short auction. Well, as it turns out, this G460 just isn't very good and only sells for £2 at CEX, so I didn't exactly get a super surprising deal. With a single core and 2 threads, this $37 or £30 Sandy Bridge CPU was the first Celeron with hyper-threading, which would have been a more significant feature if this was a dual core. It's also clocked at just 1.8 GHz, and at first I thought about sticking it at the centre of a super cheap PC build, but decided against it after using it for a bit. Instead, I thought we'd just have a bit of fun with it today, making it do things it was never really designed for. So first of all, I paired it with a very low-end GPU, a Radeon HD 4350, which in hindsight probably isn't too different in performance from the onboard 2nd gen HD graphics. For general usage, Windows 10 did not run very well at all, so I installed Windows 7 64-bit Professional and bought a super cheap license key on eBay to activate it. The performance was immediately better, to the point where general web browsing and just navigating the operating system was pretty much a hassle-free experience. Even streaming 1080p HD YouTube videos worked fine. I forgot how much I preferred Windows 7. Later on in this video, I'll be adding my GTX 1070 to this setup to see what such an imbalanced pairing can do, but for now, let's check out the G460 and 4350 handling games. In Far Cry 2, things were pretty balanced as we saw 40 FPS at 720p with the lowest settings. This CPU and old GPU worked pretty well together, and despite me thinking this would be the case throughout, it seemed that the processor was a little stronger than I expected, as the GPU started to become a bottleneck over the next couple of games. It was at this point I decided to ensure that nothing held this CPU back, and that meant slotting in my GTX 1070 into the system to allow the G460 to reach its maximum potential. This being a CPU test, I ran some CPU based benchmarks first, starting with Cinebench R15. With a multi-threaded score of 77, this puts the G460 below a lot of Core 2 duos performance-wise. In Geekbench 4 we saw a single core score of 1741 and a multi-core score of 1968, meaning that its single core performance is similar to that of some Core 2 duos or older Pentiums, but because of the lack of a physical second core, the G460 struggles in multi-threaded applications. Speaking of which, I fired up Premiere Pro 2015 to test out some editing. Instead of a video clip, I just rendered a 2MB PNG picture file and found that this took 31 seconds. Without perspective, all I can say is that this was quite a slow experience, but this was expected, seeing as it was never meant to do things like this. So far we've discovered this 35W low power processor, designed for cheap office or home PCs, is okay for that exact purpose on Windows 7, and may also make for a super cheap low powered HTPC, but feels very clunky on Windows 10. In the interest of continuing to push this thing harder though, it was time to get back to some games, this time with the 1070 still installed. Getting back to the forests of Far Cry 2, and this time we saw a more consistent experience. Having said that, we had to keep the game at low settings with 720p resolution to avoid serious frame rate drops. No one should ever pair this CPU and GPU, but I'm showing you what a best case scenario looks like for this G460, so that you know if it performs bad with a card like this, then it's going to perform bad with everything else. There was also an improvement to the performance of Farming Simulator 17, though the 1% and 0.1% lows are reflective of the many frame drops and stutters I experienced, caused of course by the CPU. In Rocket League, after an initial period of stutter at the start, the frame rate evened out at 60 and the performance was pretty good, to be honest, even if the game didn't look very good. For a laugh, I threw Battlefield 1 into the mix, and it's rare that I see a 100% CPU usage statistic with just a 1% GPU usage measurement. 720p or 1080p didn't matter, the performance was the same regardless, at the lowest settings and minimum resolution scaling of course. As I went to start up Skyrim, I noticed I forgot to close Battlefield, and this sent the system straight into meltdown. Even after restarting, I couldn't actually get Skyrim to start without crashing. Back to another demanding title now, and The Witcher 3 actually did better than I thought. It wasn't a playable experience, but we hit 20 FPS on average, about 19 more than I expected to get. The game performed better outside of city areas and may even be playable if you were to install some low-spec performance mods that eliminate shadows or reduce the textures and resolution even further. Finally, it's CSGO. Here I was ready to get into a serious action-packed game with 1080p and the lowest settings in-game. I waited for the countdown to finish, sprinted towards the enemy, and just like that it was all over. And with that, there we have it, another eBay gem that made its way into the test bench. If you want to build a cheap home system, maybe something for your parents or grandparents, then slapping this into a PC with Windows 7 would work just fine, though it doesn't make too much sense considering it would probably cost more than buying an older and more powerful Core 2 quad pre-built once you've considered the price of the motherboard and RAM. If you're assembling a budget 1155 socket gaming PC for yourself part by part, and you don't have the money for that i5 or i7 just yet, one of these will suffice to test that the rest of your hardware is at least working, and then when you buy that CPU you really want, you can swap it out and resell this again. Just start your auction at higher than a penny. So guys, there we have it. I hope you've enjoyed this fun little look at a very, very cheap processor I found on eBay. They usually don't retail used for much more than this, although I haven't seen many about recently. But as always, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like on it, leave a dislike on it if you didn't, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and hopefully I'll see you all in the next video.